Good morning. So when you see this charger up here, what you'll know from now on is that I didn't charge the computer. And so it has to happen right now. How many of you guys went to Pendleton this week? I see a few, yep, and then I see a few that are like, are we allowed to admit that? I didn't ask what you did while you were there. I just asked if you went. No judgment. You guys that know me, you'll know this to be true, is that I love getting outside of the church. Like, I love the church. I love what God does with people here. I'm a believer that God does just the coolest things with people when they say yes to sort of the process of what God does here. But I love getting outside of the church. I love going and visiting with people who have no concept of God, who have no concept of the rules or what we do here, or don't know the word. I love that, because what I don't want to ever have happen is that one day we look up and we've got the church and it exists way over here on this island, and the rest of the world, the people that are lost, that we're really hoping that God allows us to reach, are so far over there that we never cross paths. And I had a weird thing happen. God's doing some weird stuff in me right now, and I don't know. Well, for you guys that are trying to keep up, I try to stay transparent. Well, as a matter of principle, when you're trying to be transparent on a concept you haven't figured out yet, it can come across as confusion. So I'll try to do the best to just explain the stuff that I have figured out. I was in the middle of a conversation with a guy that was just hammered drunk this week, and we were talking about horses. It was completely unrelated. And as will happen, his language was awful, and I don't know if you guys know this about me, but I'm super offended by bad language. And a guy comes up and he goes, "Oh, you know Jordan?" And he goes, "Oh, you just met." And he goes, "Yeah, he's a pastor." And you could tell the guy who said it was like, like he was excited. And here's what happened. You could just see the guy go, okay. It's like, man, how frustrating is that? How frustrating is that if we have created a culture where people who don't understand who Jesus is, who don't have that walking, working relationship, how sad that the stigma is that there's an expectation of behavior that you should carry when you're around me as a pastor. Like, man, how do we fix that? This isn't even a sermon, really. It's more of just a testimony moment of like, wait a minute. Sinners loved Jesus. You know who was offended by Jesus? The religious leaders. They were the ones who were like, you're not holding up our standard. You're not holding up our expectation. None of this is in the notes. I don't even know if I'll get to the notes, which means we may be here all day. But it was the religious leaders who were like, you're not doing things the way you're supposed to do them. And Jesus was loved by people that were lost. And I love getting outside the church. I actually love getting in contact with people who are like, this is my favorite question. How does that work? You're here. The whole church should be here. Anyway, okay, I'll preach. I love where we live in Central Oregon. One of the things I love about Central Oregon community, and I know we've got Weatherford and we've got Adel, in both places, this seems to be true in both places, is that we're people who hold ourselves to a very high social standard. Socially, we hold ourselves to a very high standard. If there's a need, we will gather and we make an effort to show up for each other. When there's a crisis, everybody just jumps in, right? I love that we live in a community where there's a lot of people that don't even lock their doors at night. It says a lot about the social standard. Now, if you're watching this online, don't come to Powell, Butte and start stealing stuff. But that we hold ourselves to a very high social standard. As a result, we enjoy in these smaller rural communities, how many of you have ever been a part of this, that you get to enjoy a wonderful community? As a result, we have a great community. You don't even have to know someone. If you're in need, someone's going to show up and help. It's just, and if you see someone in need, you hold yourself to a standard that says you're expected to show up, because what if that was your cow stuck in the ditch? That's not an analogy. That's a true story. I pulled over and there was a guy trying to roll a cow over. She'd gotten stuck in a hole. So I jumped out. This is actually kind of a funny story. Again, I don't even know if this is going to be a sermon this morning, but I jumped through an irrigation ditch and got wet from my knees down, and then got shocked by a hot wire fence. You know why? Because that's just what we do. And we rolled him over. I'm like, oh, yeah. He's like, oh, thanks, yeah. And he said, I don't remember what I said, something about, hey, how's she doing or something. He goes, oh, that's not my cow. I go, whose cow is it? He goes, I have no idea. She was stuck. We just jumped out and got her unstuck. High social community. We live in a great community because we hold ourselves to high social standards. We're so blessed, but it's the weird, here's what can happen. There can be a weird false positive. We can get this idea that because of our high social standards, that somehow then equates to high spiritual standards. We can start to believe that because we hold ourselves like this is how my dad did it, this is how my grandpa did it, and you go to work for people and we're good people and we're blue collar, and I want to be able to look myself in the mirror at night and I want to make sure that I'm the person that I expect myself to be. We start to believe that equates to high spiritual health, and it doesn't. If you read through the word, what you'll find is that those are all great things. They're great things. Did we do a good thing by helping some guy get his cow out of the ditch? Sure. Is that going to be the thing that somehow creates this communication between me and God? No. Was God upset with me for helping? No. Did it earn me some sort of weird spiritual coins? Also no. That we don't necessarily understand how to maybe separate the two. How many of you guys, when you start talking about church, and like I said, I love getting outside the church because I'm reminded of what tricks the enemy loves to use. Have you ever heard this? Hey man, I don't go to church, but I'm doing my best. I actually, selfishly, I want to love that answer. Because you know what? When somebody tells you they're doing their best, generally, they are. Actually, sometimes they're putting more effort into being a good person than someone who's in the church. We hate saying amen to that, don't we? Like, well, when somebody's like really holding themselves to a high standard, they're really trying to be a good person. And they'll say, I'm just doing my best, trying to be a good person, trying to be good to people, doing the best I can, and hope that when it's my time to go that I did enough. We take that social standard, we hold ourselves to it. It works socially, but it leaves some gaps spiritually. I'm going to guess that we're going to leave this morning with more questions and answers, and for that reason, we're going to probably have to finish this sermon concept next week, would be my guess. I'll do the best I can to try to communicate what God's been dealing with me on, because here's the problem, is that God has revealed some things to me that were hidden behind a mirror, things that I thought actually, God has revealed some weaknesses in my life and also some weaknesses in our church that I promise you I believed were actually strengths. If anyone other than God himself would have showed it to me, I could have argued that they were wrong, that we were right. God's allowed me to see this over the last couple weeks, just some areas, not that we're doing things bad. It's not that we're lost and doing anything wrong. See, that's the problem. We can defend anything that's not wrong. There's a story, I'm just going to read it to you. There's a story told from the Civil War days, and I've heard this in church. I've heard this story probably 10 times in my life in church. But it's about a northerner who went to a slave auction and purchased a young slave girl. As they walked away from the auction, the man turned to the girl and told her, "You're free." With amazement, she said, "You mean I'm free to do whatever I want?" "Yes," he said. "And to say whatever I want?" "Yes, anything." "And to be whoever I want to be?" "Yep." And she said, "Even go wherever I want to go?" And he said with a smile, "Yes, you're free to go wherever you'd like." She thought about it for a minute, looked at him, and intently replied, "Then I'll go with you." I wonder if somebody were to say, "Man, I don't go to church." Why? I wonder how often the freedom thing would come up. Because it doesn't match this idea, this standard that we've set for the lives. We feel like that we're going to be less of ourselves if we submit ourselves to a church community. We're going to be less of ourselves if we follow the rules the way that they're written. We feel like that it's going to cost us some of our freedom if we were to submit and say, "God, I want to follow you. I want to do what you want me to do. I want to be who you want me to be." I wonder how many times people resist that because they're afraid that there's some freedom that they're going to have to give up. I read that story, and the reason I love that story is it's such a good example. The guy says, you're free to decide. I paid the price so that you can make a decision. And it says in Galatians 5, I would love to tell you, like, so I haven't preached in 2 weeks and I've read the whole Bible. I have been stuck on one chapter for 2 weeks. It's like every time I try to move on, I just come back to it. And it's just like God is just one chapter. So where have you been for 2 weeks? Usually if I'm gone from here, I'm preaching somewhere else. Nope, I haven't preached at all. One chapter. That's how just spiritually progressive your pastor is. But listen to this. In Galatians chapter 5, Paul says this. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. So it says you're free. There's a freedom associated with being who God wants you to be. He says, I've set you free. But then it says this, stand firm then and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. It's a gift, but it's also a command. It says that I bought you out of slavery. Don't go back into it. Now, when we think slavery, when we think bondage, what we instantly go to is addiction. Addiction operates as bondage because people want out and they cannot get out. So God says, I've paid the price so that you can be free from sin. Don't go back. It's a gift. It's a command. And so we say things like, well, I'm a Christian. I don't do drugs. Good. I mean, that's good. Don't get me wrong. Good that you don't, if you're not doing drugs, great. If you are, this is probably still a good sermon. We think of freedom, then we think of addiction, and just a list, alcohol addiction, drugs, pornography, gambling, and that now we hear like, hey, wait a minute, there's freedom from our addiction, there's freedom from our sin. That in and of itself could be the sermon. That could be the whole sermon. That if you're struggling with addiction, God has a desire to see you be set free. And that not only does he have a desire to see you be set free, but to stay free and to live free. That's a good sermon. In and of itself, by itself, that's a great sermon. But to be honest, the devil isn't really hidden in those things. Have you ever seen somebody that's spent their life strung out in addiction? It's almost like you can just see the face of sin that has just tormented them. It almost is like they start to look like the victim instead of the victimizer. Does that make sense? Have you guys ever walked around Las Vegas before lunch? I see some of you, yes? You can almost pick the people who have been there for a long time. People that are just shackled to sin and being drugged behind it with no way out. The devil's not hidden in that. Anybody could look at that and go, not what I want in my life. The enemy is nowhere hidden in this addiction that just destroys life. And listen to this, 1 Peter 5:8 says, be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls. Goes on, but I'm going to stop at that word. The enemy prowls. He sneaks around and he hides. He hides in things that aren't so obvious. It's not like he's going, hey, if you come join, sin's not that bad. What did he say to Adam? Oh, it's not that bad. You'll eat from the tree of, knowledge. You'll know things. You'll know a lot of information. But what he didn't can include is that they would be severing themselves from the tree of life. So many times we want the information, but we don't want the life that goes with it. Totally different sermon. But it says that he prowls, he hides, he takes partial truths, and he feeds you enough partial truth that you believe it. And even though it's only the partial truth, what's hidden is the danger. He prowls. That means he's far less obvious than the major addictions. Verse 4, so that was verse 1, it says it's for freedom, stay free. You've been set free, stay free. Imagine the frustration if you had purchased someone's freedom for them and they go, oh, thanks. And they go right back to a different plantation and they go, whoop, sign me up, I'll be a slave here. And you're like, says, I've set you free, now stay free. And then verse 4 says this, you who are trying to be justified by the law have been alienated from Christ. See, that's where the enemy prowls. He goes, oh, you're not an alcoholic anymore. You're like, yeah, I guess I'm not. That guy, still an alcoholic. Oh, thank God I'm not like him. And the cuff starts to slam closed on your wrist, and you go, I don't want to be an alcoholic. I'm only picking one. I'm only picking on one. Keep in mind I spent the week at Pendleton. I'm just grabbing one out of the air. Whatever it may be. I'm not picking on anybody. But this ditch of addiction over here, and we want so far away from it that we just hard swerve, and what we don't realize is that there's a ditch on the other side of the road too, and that ditch is legalism, where we stay so far away from sin, we don't even want to be around sinners. See, it says, but Paul's saying, but that's a trap too. Even legalism is a trap. I hate to borrow volunteers. I'm sorry. Scott, I know you're writing. Can I borrow you for just a second? Just for a second. I didn't tell him I was going to do this. Just come up here for just a second. Let me tell you the trap that churches are stuck in. Come over here. I didn't warn him. We could have set this up. I don't know if you guys know this or not. Scott is one of my best friends. I kind of realize I'm running some social risk. Like, oh, by the way, if you don't mind. Let me show you the trap that I see churches being stuck in. Not church. Church is great. Church is God's creation. I'm not anti-church. I am anti-sin. And when you bring people into a church, what happens is through the door that the church opens for people, sin sneaks in with it. So please understand, there is no greater fan of churches, of what churches do, than myself. But I also see that there's a trap, and the Bible says you're expected to stay free. So if I see an area where we are not free, I want to at least identify it. He's 1 foot ahead of me. Now I'm 1 foot ahead of him. Okay, now you do the same thing. Oh man, he doesn't drink at all. He doesn't do drugs. He doesn't say bad words. He doesn't even watch R-rated movies. I don't watch movies at all. Thank you. I'm going to come back to that. Why was that important? I'm going to come back to it. But do you see this to the point that we completely lose sight of the fact that we have been given freedom? That is not freedom. If that is your walk with God, always measuring and always comparing and always wondering what people are thinking and always looking for approval, you are not free. You are in bondage to legalism. And the Lord has commanded you, stay free. Stay free from addiction, and then stay free from the legalism that is alienating you from Jesus. What that means is that Jesus is going, what are you... The same Jesus that you're trying to impress is going, stop it. The legalism. Hard stop right here. Listen, it's not about good versus evil. It's about good versus God. The enemy is not going to tempt you with evil because you're not stupid. He's not going to tempt you with evil. He's going to tempt you with good. So if you have this big wide open filter that allows everything good to come through, you're at the greatest risk because the enemy will use good versus God. Here's the hard stop. If you were to walk out into a street where people are protesting, right now, we've got such a physical, great, visible example. Walk out into the street and go, hey, what are you protesting? And they're like, rah, whatever side, doesn't matter. They're both, bah. Like, I would like to suggest that maybe you're wrong. Don't bother, for the record, don't bother. Because short of God intervening, it is almost, fingernails, just almost impossible to permeate through someone who believes that they're right and cause them to consider that they might be wrong. Almost impossible. It's a task I couldn't hope to achieve this morning. So please understand what I'm going to do is I want to put some information out there, and I'm going to pray that God allows what God allows, which is those moments to go, I thought that was one of my strengths. That's what I'm going through right now. I thought that was one of my strengths, and now I'm realizing it wasn't one of my strengths. It's actually one of my weaknesses. I wasn't right. I was wrong. It's the hardest thing that someone can go through mentally to believe what they believe. What about this? How did you vote last year? Don't tell me. It would be as impossible as trying to convince you to then vote for the other side. There's no way. Doesn't even matter which side you voted on. I'm saying that level of reconsideration times 1,000. To stop and consider that you might be wrong is the hardest thing people can do. It's almost impossible. But if this sermon's going to make sense, we've got to at least consider that an area that we have buttoned up. Here's the problem. The people who need what we're going to say this morning are the people who are least likely to hear it. The people who need to hear what we're saying this morning are the people who are the least likely to hear it. I'm aware of it. I'm going there anyway. There's the hurdle that Paul was facing also. If you know Paul, you know that he firsthand knew how difficult it was to convince someone who was so confident they were right to believe that they were wrong. Paul, who wrote Galatians 5, was saying, you think that you're better because you're better at following the rules, but the rule following has turned into a trap. Have you ever dealt with somebody who's legalistic? The opposite, for the record, the opposite of legalism is not hedonism. The opposite of legalism is love. Legalism is an endeavor to remove love out of a situation, follow the rules so that you can remain independent from God. Legalism is a desire to set yourself up as God, to save yourself through your own actions. People think of legalism the opposite of being a complete sinful runaway, and the truth is they're both equally sinful. So this morning, when I talk about legalism, what I mean is this: removing love, grasping rules, trying to set yourself up as your own God so that you can write God out of the equation. You don't realize that's what you're doing. That's just a trap that the enemy wants to use to enslave you again. Verse 19, Paul starts to read off these sins. It says, the acts of the flesh are obvious: sexual immorality, impurity, and debauchery. Yeah, I can go with that. Idolatry, yeah. Witchcraft, yeah. Hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissension, and factions. I want to warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God. One jumped out at me this week. Just one. And last week, because like I said, I've been stuck on one chapter for 2 weeks. I actually asked God, I'm like, is this okay? Every time I open my Bible, I'm reading the same chapter over and over again. Am I allowed to just do just that? Let me read you the list. Sexual immorality, yeah, that would make sense. Impurity, yeah. Debauchery, yep. Idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, yeah, sure. But then selfish ambition. Selfish ambition, this is a fun one. Because our entire United States culture, the fuel that drives our machine, the fuel that drives our society, and if we're not careful, the fuel that drives the church can be selfish ambition. Now, if you think selfish ambition is being greedy, why wouldn't you just say greedy? If you think of selfish ambition as being jealousy, that's already on the list. It was separate. If you think of selfish ambition as doing all sorts of sinful things to benefit yourself, why wouldn't you have said those things? Selfish ambition. How many of you guys have ever stopped to consider that ambition can be anything but a good thing? We're ingrained that ambition, man, the world is your oyster if you're just ambitious enough. If you have this ambition, if you have this drive, if you have this motivation, if you're a hard worker, the world is out there for you to conquer. Ambition, gold star. And yet there in the word, Paul lists selfish ambition as the list of sins with idolatry and witchcraft. It just seems like, do you guys ever watch Sesame Street? Had that game, which one of these things does not fit? Like apple, orange, banana, bicycle, and you're like, bicycle. Doesn't it seem like as you're reading through this list, hatred, discord, jealousy, impurity, debauchery, selfish ambition, wait a minute, why the selfish ambition? Why is that one so bad? Remember, the people who need this sermon are the people who are least likely to hear it. The reason it was personal to Paul is that selfish ambition almost cost Paul his life and his entire eternity. It was the one specifically that almost cost him the most. Paul didn't suffer with sin the way that we would normally categorize sin. Philippians 3. Would you be surprised? Would you remember the thing that Scott and I just did? Do you know what selfish ambition, when you translate it from the Greek, you know the word that best describes selfish ambition? Electioneering. Electioneering. You go, well, what's electioneering? No, I'm a little better. No, I'm gonna run a little far. I'm gonna work a little harder. I'm gonna get up a little earlier. I'm gonna stay up a little later. I'm gonna earn a little bit more. I'm gonna do a little bit better. I'm gonna be the best Christian in the whole world. I'm gonna make God proud of me. Why is this sermon so hard for people who need to hear it the most? Is they appear to be the most put together. Selfish ambition is usually the sin that captures the people who look like they have it all together. And the people who have it all together thrive on this idea that they're leading some sort of a race. This is a hard sermon. Listen, this is a hard sermon. It's about to get worse. Philippians 3, verse 4. It says, if someone else thinks they have reason to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Here's Paul. He's explaining why selfish ambition made the list. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for righteousness based on the law, faultless. Paul says, I had set my standard impossibly high, and I was achieving it. I wasn't just doing right, I was doing more right. I wasn't just following the law, I was following more of the law. I wasn't just born into the right tribe, I was born into the perfect tribe. It said I had set my standards so high and I had set my goals on achieving it. Now listen, we are not geared towards criticizing someone who sets their standard high and then sets out to achieve it. In fact, we applaud those people. Why? Because it isn't wrong. The goals are not wrong. Achievement, not wrong. Ambition, not wrong. The reason that it is so hard to pinpoint when it turns into a problem is because from the outside, selfish ambition is invisible. The only person who could accurately say, yes, I'm struggling from selfish ambition is the person who can see what goes on behind the curtain. See, if you're struggling with addiction, people have interventions all the time. That's fun. Jordan, this is hard for us. We all see it and you don't. Anybody ever been a part of an intervention? Don't answer. It's 2017. As far as I know, no one's ever called anybody in and said, we need to talk. You're struggling with ambition. You're working really hard, you're doing everything perfect, you're earning, you're providing, you're following the rules, you're a perfect citizen. It's bad. I think I'm gonna make it, but thank you all for being here. He wasn't driven by human approval. Now, this is where it gets personal. This is where it turns into more of a testimony than a sermon. My whole life, I've never struggled with human approval. I mean, I like it. Don't get me wrong. I love approval. I'm not inhuman. I love approval. But I don't live for it. I don't strive for it. I don't seek it. I've always seen where people are weak when they need approval. I've seen pastors who have just run themselves ragged trying to gain approval instead of just doing what they believe to be right. And I've always felt like that was a strength. Truthfully, I always felt like that was a strength of mine because people can't dangle the anytime someone starts a conversation, you can tell when they're trying to appeal to your need for approval because they'll go, there's a lot of us that have been thinking, doesn't matter. You can all think something. If I believe that I'm doing what God's called me to do, I'll do it myself. But the cool part of that is that brings a lot of people like that in. It's actually part of the shape of the culture of what we've done here is that we're not a real approval-seeking church. When I say pedal your own bike, what that means is stop looking around for approval and do what you know to be right. Have we done anything necessarily wrong based on the fact that I don't need approval? No, not necessarily. Paul, he didn't need approval. He wasn't looking for approval. He had a higher standard set for himself than anybody else would have set for him. That's why when somebody goes, hey, Jordan, great job, I can go, thanks, but I haven't achieved what I was trying to achieve yet. Nobody in my life, I'm 34 years old, I'll be 35 next month. Nobody in my life has ever, not one time ever, set a higher standard for me than I've set for myself in my lifetime, ever. So that's why human approval has never ranked very high on the list, is that I had this idea of what I wanted to accomplish and who I wanted to be. Let me read you a couple of my thoughts. This was hard to write down. This is the biggest struggle in my life, and I didn't know it was a struggle. They say when you preach, don't preach yourself, preach Jesus. Well, I've got to explain to you why I was flawed before what Jesus did will make sense. I was a driven child. Even as a kid, I was driven. I would get up in the morning, I would work. I had a job that I had to be at I had to be there at 7 o'clock, and I would make sure I got all the horses ridden before I went to work at 7 o'clock in the morning. When I was a sophomore in high school, I worked 50 hours a week at a feed store and did school on the side so I could rodeo on the weekends and I could pay for it all myself. If there's any temptation, you go, oh, great, Jordan's going to tell us how great he is. Please just let me get through what I'm trying to say. I almost resented compliments. People go, oh, that's great. And I'll be like, you think it's great because you don't know where I'm going. It's not great. I'm not even close. I don't want compliments. The only thing that I would ever really own was failures. When it would fail, I would go, that's why I'm not where I wanted to be yet. I could own failures. I couldn't own successes because I hadn't accomplished what I had set out to accomplish. So when Paul says, I held myself to a high standard, I understand that. No one's ever had an intervention that said, Jordan, your ambition is killing you. I wanted to be honest. I want to be an honest person. It's a big deal to me. I want to be honest. And that's kind of works out good when you don't need approval, because sometimes you can be honest even if it costs you approval. I'd rather be honest than approved of. Some of you guys have got to enjoy the fun that comes with that. Is that a bad thing to be honest? No, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. I want to be a good person. I want to be a good husband. I want to be a good father. I want to do things with excellence. I want to be a good pastor. I want to be a good cowboy. Are any of these things bad things? No. Are they disobedient? No. Has it driven me to some good things? Yes, absolutely. I think God honestly allows you to just struggle with some things for a while, because in the end, he's going to take everything that he's been doing and use it. The problem is not that, hey, I need to confess I've been caught in sin or anything like that. It's not that. It's that God has allowed me to see something, and I think if I can explain it in a way that makes sense, because again, God's desire for me is freedom. God's desire for you is freedom. God's desire for you is to set down legalism and to pick up love and relationship and to operate as who he wanted you to be. My whole life has been a pursuit. Anybody else, you don't have to raise your hand, but has anybody else's life felt like just a lifelong pursuit? Just a driven pursuit. I don't want to sit down. I don't want to rest. I don't want a vacation. I don't want to take time off. I want to get to wherever it is that I'm going. I don't even know necessarily where that is, but I have this drive to get there. And it's like I have invited God into my life to help me with that pursuit. If I'm not careful, it's like I ask God, like, God, what am I not doing? What am I not doing? God, come on. I invite God to participate in my mania. God, God's desire for me is that I be free. The enemy was prowling in that. There is a prowling faction in my life that I wasn't even aware of. It didn't feel like peace. It didn't feel like rest. It certainly didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a drive. And like I said, I live around driven people. I'm friends with driven people. I have friends who are as driven as I am. They have goals and they have things that they want to accomplish. But if you're not careful, here's the problem. The enemy's not stupid. He wants to come in and rob you of your freedom using things that are not God. He'll use things that are good. Okay. Verse 7 says, but whatever were gains to me now, this is Philippians 3 still. But whatever were gains to me now, I consider loss for the sake of Christ. What happened to Paul? What happened? Because Paul was striving for this standard. Paul had this unbelievably high expectation for himself. Listen, if you're somebody who goes, I don't need the approval of others, hear me, because this is where we're going this morning. If you're somebody who operates because your standard for yourself is higher than the standard anybody else has ever had for you, listen to what Paul says. He says, I now consider everything that I accomplished a loss for the sake of knowing Christ. For the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. You want to know something funny about the word? Sometimes I think the translators thought that in English, we just weren't grown up enough to handle what was actually being said, so they tone it down. Do your own research. It says, I now consider them garbage. Do your own research how that word translates. Paul says, everything I accomplished was crap. It's the Bible. You're going to criticize me? I can hide behind it. It says everything that I had set for myself, every standard that I had pursued, every expectation I held for myself, every morning that I got up and I went to work and pursued something, every time I walked by and said, I've got to be somebody that I can look myself in the mirror at night. I've got to be able to be somebody who I can respect. I've got to be that person. Everything that I accomplished, Paul says it was a complete loss that he may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own, but that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. I want to know Christ. The willingness to suffer, the willingness to take criticism, the willingness to take abuse, it's not a bad thing as long as it's aimed in the right direction. Because listen to what Paul says now. Yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings. Becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining resurrection from the dead. How does a guy turn it around? How does a guy thinking he's right to the point of persecuting Christians? He is so devout. He is so driven. He is so locked down. He is so disciplined. He is so much better than everybody else around him. How does that guy have a moment that turns things around and he goes the other direction where he says, I don't even want to be an eloquent preacher. I just want you to see Jesus. How does that happen? Here's the problem. When you're pursuing your own validation or your own approval, here's the problem. You can say, I don't need the approval of others. The problem is your approval of yourself is still the approval of man. I never thought of that. I'd never considered, because it wasn't that I wanted to be a bad guy. I wanted to be a good guy. I wanted to do everything I did with excellence. I wanted to work hard, but I wasn't experiencing freedom because I was still pursuing the pursuit of human approval, but it was my own approval. Selfish ambition. Acts chapter 9 says this, as he, Paul, journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. Then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? This is what it takes. If you're going to see someone turn around, this is what it takes. It says, who are you? Isn't that what we would probably say if Jesus showed up and goes, why is everybody just following the rules? Because that's how you do it. It's electioneering. Jesus goes, that's a result. You get to know me, you begin to walk in freedom, you'll follow all the rules. You want to hear something funny? I said this to a guy this week. I know a lot of people who have terrible language. And I know a lot of people who would never say a swear word, ever. And can I tell you something? Just observation. The people who pride themselves on never having bad language are generally way bigger jerks about it. And they use it to prove that they're somehow better. It's a trap. It's a trap when we pursue human approval. Paul says, who are you? I thought I thought I was doing better than everyone. Why are you attacking me? I'm leading the race. It says, I'm Jesus whom you are persecuting. Verse 6, here's where it is. Here's where it is and we're done. So he, trembling and astonished, says it's just overwhelming to him. He's trembling, he's fearful, and he's having this moment where he goes, I was leading the charge. Here's the problem. You can look like you're winning the race if you're running the wrong direction. Paul had this moment where he's like, what? Then I'm not special at all. I'm not superior. I haven't earned anything. I haven't achieved my own And he finally asked the right question. He finally asked the question that if we as a church are going to continue in the right direction, we have individually got to start asking. It's not, well, I'm better at this. Well, I do this. Well, here's my qualifications. Well, here's what qualifies me. Well, here's what I do. Well, here's my gifts. Well, here's what I'm all about. Well, here's my truth. Well, here's my stand. Bleh. If we can get past all the garbage and ask the right question, Paul says this, Lord, what do you want me to do? What would please you? The problem with people fighting in the streets is that they think they're right. And even if their argument is right, they're asking the wrong question because they go to war without ever asking the question, God, what do you want? I believe the other side's doing some terrible things, but what do you want from me? What would please you? What do you want to see from me? And what would please you? What did you create me to do? It's the ultimate question of life of God. What do you see when you look at me? What did you create me to be? What would please you? If we can begin to ask that question, it begins to disassemble all of our own self-righteous standards. And in fact, what we'll find is that it's not even about pleasing anybody else or pleasing ourselves. It is 100% about pleasing God. I got one more verse and then we really are done. As I continue to close. 1 John 4:18 says, there is no fear in love. But perfect love drives out fear because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. I don't have time this morning. We'll maybe get to it next week, but I will say this. When you track back through driven ambition, I love being a hard worker. I love having ambition. I love dreaming. I love expansion. I love all of it. But if my heart, if at the very heart, my motivation is not, God, what do you want to see? God, what makes you happy? Then I am operating at a level of fear. Fear that I'm going to be ordinary. Fear that I'm going to fail. Fear at the end of the day that everything that I've tried isn't going to work. And God says when you begin to operate in love, when you begin to love me, you are set perfectly free. Let's pray. God, this is a hard truth to chew on. This is a lot to try to absorb.